Have you ever wondered why the English language equates words for seeing and visualization with knowing and comprehending? Here are some examples. Eye-opening experience. I can see your point. Everything is clear. I see what you mean. I can see where you're coming from. I see where you're going. I can see through your argument. See solutions to problems. I just wanted to see what it felt, tasted, smelled, sounded like, as if we could see, feels, tastes, smells, and sounds. Seeing is believing, and many others. What if I told you that associating seeing with thinking and knowing is not universal across language families and cultures, but rather bound to specific languages and societies? In this video, we'll look at the evolution of the eye, what it means, what it implies, how it manifests culturally, and what its anthropological significance is. Let's look at the opening of the first book of Aristotle's Metaphysics, which is unquestionably the founding work of Western thought, the forefather and the originator of what is known as Western philosophy. All men naturally desire knowledge. An indication of this is our esteem for the senses. For apart from their use, we esteem them for their own sake, and most of all the sense of sight. Not only with a view to action, but even when no action is contemplated, we prefer sight, generally speaking, to all other senses. The reason of this is that of all the senses, sight best helps us know things and reveals many distinctions. Fast forward to the closing of the 20th century, Richard Dawkins, an accomplished scientist, public intellectual, and thought leader, writes in his book, Unweaving the Rainbow, "After slipping through 100 million centuries, we have finally opened our eyes on a sumptuous planet, sparkling with color, bountiful with life. Within decades, we must close our eyes again. Isn't it a noble and enlightened way of spending our brief time in the sun to work at understanding the universe and how we have to come to wake up in it? This is how I answer when I'm asked, as I'm surprisingly often, why I bother to get up in the mornings. To put it the other way around, isn't it sad to go to your grave without ever wondering why you were born? Who with such a thought would not spring from bed, eager to resume discovering the world and rejoicing to be a part of it?" Is there something broader going on concerning sight being the dominant sense organ in Western thought? For us to answer this question, we need a very concentrated journey of how the concept of eye and seeing functioned between the entire 23 centuries and beyond the Western culture. We need to define the concept of vision, what changes and understandings did seeing undergone throughout the cultural evolution, and what language was used to denote seeing as knowing. Did eye become dominant sense at a certain point in time? Were there other sense organs that were privileged before that? Are there cultural variations between the epistemological value of sense organs? We're going to embark on an anthropological journey from ancient cultures to modern Western Europe, and how it contrasts different cultures, including my own. Before delving into a pivotal turning point when the metaphor of vision became dominant sense of cognizing the world, I would like to draw your attention to a more fundamental notion of mind's eye. The external world, the world of matter, has no inbuilt epistemological value to it. The tree that you are looking at has nothing to say about its value, essence, or purpose, which brings me to the statement that information per se is neutral and indifferent. However, the mental apparatus of the living organism is a filter through which the information coming to the senses assembles into a comprehensible picture, along with functions that will be ascribed to it. Namely, what should you do with it, what it means to you, what it looks like, etc. So for one, a birdsong is devoid of any kind of inbuilt intrinsic meaning. However, a female chick experiences it as a calling for mating, whereas a zoologist is prompted to make a scientific investigation. Thus, an organism comes with its inbuilt system of cognition, which makes meaning generation possible. Immanuel Kant had an extensive overview of how our mind shapes the raw matter of the external environment by applying concepts of quantity-quality relation and modality to it. Kant, in his magnum opus Critique of Pure Reason, stated that time and space are a priori intuitions of pure reason. Pure reason being a faculty that is free from empirical knowledge, thus being a house of a priori forms of knowledge. Therefore, everything you experience is possible by processing them into our inbuilt intuition of space and time, which constitutes the necessary precondition that makes experience possible as such. Now, Richard Dawkins, an evolutionary biologist, came up with a concept, the middle world. We live in a world that is governed by classical physics and Newtonian mechanics. A world that is populated by objects that are neither infinitely small nor infinitely large. Furthermore, the laws that governs the universe at a larger scale, Einstein's general relativity, is very much unintuitive for us, as we evolved in the middle world. We generally can't fathom, and it seems intuitive for us when we are told that time and space is relative. On the flip side, quantum physics describes the behavior of an infinitely small particles and defies our sense of intuition even further. It's noteworthy to point out that when scientists try to provide analogies to explain relativity theory and quantum mechanics, those analogies are in essence middle-worldly, meaning common sense. The bottom line here is that things that take place within the constraints of the middle world populate our universal common sense with which we process the external world. Dawkins goes on to suggest that the brain, like every other organ, evolved specific inbuilt adaptive concepts that help us perceive and interact with the middle world. For example, we cannot imagine the actual size of the atom, the same way we are unable to picture the vastness of the universe, as the world we evolved into is dominated by objects that are medium in size. In the same way, our intuition tells us that a cannonball would hit the ground faster than a feather, the reason being that we did not evolve in a vacuum, as in the middle world, air friction is always there. Also, we tend to think that only solid things have real existence, whereas the behavior of particles at the quantum level seems unrealistic, as we did not evolve in that particular environment. Now, I wanted to set up a notion of sensory modality as something that organizes, that which gives something a form and shape, and thus ascribes value to it. A value that greatly varies concerning the challenge put forward by the environment. From there, we can get to the meaning of the metaphor and the concept of vision as it was abstracted from the physiological sense organ that we possess. My job now is to present how and when the metaphor of the eye became what it is today. After the evolution of abstract thought, language, extensive tool use, social brain, and higher cognitive abilities, Homo sapiens have undergone major changes in the organization of their living. Before the so-called agricultural revolution, Homo sapiens lived as hunter-gatherers, isolated in different tribes. After the gradual shift from hunting and gathering to sedentary life, which began in 10,000 BC, the abstract symbolic layer of cultural symbols and sign systems experienced a qualitative shift and quantitative increase. This new Homo sapiens of the Neolithic period is our subject of interest. I want to look at the major cultural contrast between the philosophically oriented cultures of new generation, such as ancient Greece and Western culture, which were progressive in nature, and the archaic cultures and social formations, including the extinct ones and those that have survived, including the place of my origin. To kickstart the thesis of my video, without further ado, let's see how Jean Gebser differentiates the mental consciousness structure that characterizes ancient Greek, Western, and Judeo-Christian societies from previous consciousness structures such as magic and mythic, which dominated the world of Upper Paleolithic up to the archaic pre-mental cultures. Gebser takes eye as a primary sense organ of the mental structure, whereas magic gets the ear and mythic the mouth. For a little sneak peek, if you want to translate an English common phrase denoting the success of thinking, namely, I see your point, into my native language, Georgian, one of the most archaic languages out there, you would get, I hear your point. Now, in Dravidian languages, another example of archaic culture, saying telling is used in reports of thinking. Drawing an example from Koya, the standard and most common way to say he had a thought would be Tanaki itondu, to himself he said. In Turkish, another non-Indo-European language, to say I see your point, you would say Senin deginmek istediğin noktayı anlıyorum, where deginmek denotes touch rather than vision. Although I could present the answer to this question very briefly, it would not make justice to this problem, and I'm not generally attracted to such formats. So we need to go down a cultural rabbit hole to see how eye and the metaphor of vision acquired their value. Mostly Egypt, spanning the galloping 3,000-year dynasty, is thought of as one of the earliest mega-civilizations. However, Egypt, apart from being one of the first, is also a meta-culture. Its cultural forms and achievements functioned as a mimetic repository for subsequent social formations, which inevitably were influenced by the everlasting eye of Egypt. Here are the major themes about it that are relevant to the video. Egypt is one of the first which draws a straight and orderly line on the curvaceous and ever-liquid nature. The hardest object of Apollonian thing-making is Western personality, the glamorous, striving, separatist ego, first appeared in art of Old Kingdom Egypt. Thus the Apollonian eye as an arrow and projectile into the beyond with its phallic aggression, later creating guns, pointy ships with giant eyes to explore and colonize the world, cinema with its blazing light beam of movie projectors, rockets flying in space, and many others can be witnessed in Egypt in its embryonic form, allowing us to look at the hypertrophy of the eye as if we are witnessing a flowering plant in a time lapse. However, the growth of an eye, unlike plants, is going to be inward rather than outward. In what turned out to be a famous video about female sexual objectification, I talked about the evolution from the eyeless and faceless Venus figurines to Egyptian Nefertiti, which is solely a face where everything leads to her eyes, denoting a shift from the impersonal unconscious condition of the Great Mother archetype to the emergence of personality and the self, which is in direct ontological relationship with the concept of vision and later the mind's eye. The Egyptian eye is analogous to Western personality, as the soul was thought to reside there. Note how in Egypt, eye is always shown full face, even though characters are painted in profile. As Gombrich observes, the Egyptian painter distinguished, for instance, between a dark brown for men and pale yellow for women's bodies. The real flesh tone of the person portrayed mattered as little in this context as the real color of river matters to the cartographer. Egyptian eye is the first demonstrable and aggressive standoff against the muck and muddle of Chtonian nature. With its black-tailed outline and makeup, the eye represents a clear definition and order against the backdrop of entropic nature, striving towards perpetual chaos. However, as the sun is the force that keeps nature from getting to an entropic death, the same way the golden disk and sky gods of the new cultures guard the consciousness and its Apollonian order against the devouring Great Mother archetype. The Venus of Willendorf, a cult image half modeled from a rough stone, is unbeautiful because art has not yet found its relation to the eye. Her fat is a symbol of abundance in an age of famine. She is the too-muchness of nature which man longs to direct his salvation. She is eyeless because the sleeping consciousness of magic and mythic nature can be seen but not known. Thus, vision and the emergence of the eye are of conceptual importance. It's not about seeing, it's about having the ability to see through nature and conceive a model and an understanding of it, rather than a reflection. Now, to briefly address the controversy, I read the criticism that somehow the facelessness of Venus figurines had to do with low-level crafting skills, and psychological processes had nothing to do with it. Here's a quick fact. There are figurines with faces in the pre-civilizational period. And here's the ancient Greek sculpture of Persephone, a goddess of the underworld who is faceless, as it represents the ever-present gaping unconscious with its danger of swallowing the whole persona in the belly of the Great Mother. I highly doubt that Greeks didn't have the relevant tools for sculpting faces. It's worthwhile to note that culture is the one who conceives beauty standards, not nature. The Apollonian freeze frame of civilization comes in, trying to apply shape to unorganized matter. Thus the fashion and maximal intervention in women's freedom so that the Great Mother archetype can be in check. Standards of beauty is created by emerging Apollonian consciousness, which aims at limiting women's sexual allure. Thus we get a sense of glamour and cultural sense of aesthetics as opposed to nature's excesses. The Apollonian eye is the brain's great victory over the bloody open mouth of Mother Nature. The contemplative, conceptual, and artistic sense of the eye was conceived in Egypt, and later acquired a philosophical layer in Greece. Thus Egypt is the first to oppose the light-emitting eye of consciousness to the daemonic eye of the staring Gorgon, which paralyzes and devours everything it encounters. Gorgon's name comes from the adjective gorgos, which means the terrible and fierce, thus the Gorgopos, the fierce-eyed. Egypt is one of the first to apply the judging Apollonian gaze to nature, the one who creates its own mountains as opposed to real ones, the one who creates its sense of beauty, which is trimmed and constrained as opposed to nature's wallowing fertility figurines. No wonder why Egypt is the first to glamorize small breasts, which will be seen in the Western Renaissance once again. Egypt comes up with the personality of single self with the sun disk, symbolizing the dominance and empowerment of the shining bright light of consciousness over the darkness of nature. Now remember how someone's intelligence is called bright, and how awkward it would be to call them loud? Remember how for Plato the sun and the light represented the highest truth and virtue as opposed to the darkness of the cave? How was Jesus incorporated as Sol Invictus in the Roman Empire? How does he himself utter the words, "I am the light"? We will get to the contrast between Greek thought and consciousness that preceded it in a moment. Thus, by the power of directive light, Egypt is one of the first to hack away at nature's excess, coming up with a definition by drawing lines as opposed to the curves and circles of nature's Euroboric element. How did beauty begin? Earth cult suppressing the eye locks men in the belly of mothers. There is, I insisted, nothing beautiful in nature. Nature is primal power, coarse and turbulent. Beauty is our weapon against nature. By it we make objects, giving them limit, symmetry, and proportion. Beauty halts and freezes the melting flux of nature. Generally, Mother Nature is conceptualized like a typical wallpaper of the Windows XP. However, it's just a thin layer above the turbulent, ugly, and devouring gaping mouth of the Chthonian world. We say that nature is beautiful, but this aesthetic judgment, which not all people have shared, is another defense formation willfully inadequate for encompassing nature's totality. What is pretty in nature is confined to the thin skin of the globe, upon which we huddle. Scratch that skin, and nature's demonic ugliness will erupt. However, culture, a symbolic superstructure, filters and circumscribes the perpetual Heraclitean flow of nature into a system of meanings. That's why the layer of existence dominated by consciousness is called the noosphere. Note how the word nous, which comes from the Greek roots, means to see. It is only later that nous acquires a meaning of consciousness/mind, which will be explored in the section about Greek culture. The prevalence of stone and lack of wood in Egypt marks the sense of permanence, a phallic sky-pointing Apollonian line defying time and organic change, understood as an essential property of Heraclitean nature. That's why its art is glyphic, meaning they carve out their world-feeling on an unregenerate nature of the stone, drawing a demarcation line between nature and culture. Western personality is hard, impermeable, intractable. Spengler says the brilliant polish of the stone in Egyptian art makes the eye glide along the statue's surface. Writing arose in Egypt around the same period as in Sumer, or a little later, about 3100 BC. It appears that there are all three forms, pictograms, ideograms, and phonograms, were used alongside each other in different contexts throughout. Now, the reason that this interests me is that when language acquires a dimension of writing, a new layer of reality is formed, whereby systems of symbolic meaning become self-replicative and form a symbolic order. Now, from a neuro-anthropological perspective, we can speculate that this process has to do with the neural reorganization of the angular gyrus, especially of the left hemisphere. We know from studies that lesions in the left angular gyrus eliminate abstract skills like reading, writing, and arithmetic. Angular gyrus is a brain area situated in the lower part of the parietal lobe, near its junction with the occipital and temporal lobes, thus being a hotspot where information from different modalities come in and organizes into a meaningful picture. It is involved in high-level abstraction and abilities such as reading, writing, arithmetic, left-right discrimination, word representation, the representation of fingers, and possibly also comprehension of metaphor and proverbs. The angular gyrus is possibly unique to humans. It is also probably rich in mirror neurons that allow you to see the world from another's point of view. This is of utmost importance, as the prefrontal cortex, later to be hypertrophied with the advance of abstract philosophy and Euclidean geometry, forms reentrant connections with angular gyrus. Generally, emergence of the new mental skills has to do with the inner reorganization of white matter connectivity that accounts for intracortical connections. I think that it is a warranted speculation that the advance in metaphor, writing, and Apollonian consciousness has to do with the reorganization of the existing parts of the brain so that it can adapt to new challenges and environments. Note that the skill of imitation and abstract thought is foundational for emerging civilizations. The popular eye of Horus functioned as a protective apotropic force, deflecting misfortune and averting the evil eye. It is not an accident that the eye of the Horus was understood as an eye of the mind, the eye of the insight and truth. Note how deep knowledge is denoted by word insight, and the eye of the god inside the human mind. Now, political organization of ancient Egypt, where the pharaoh is an unblinking wise eye representing the head of the state, is an organizing power of the people as a body. Thus, he unifies the scattered many into a hierarchical system of order. This process makes evident the primordial opposition between the Apollonian order and the chaos of Dionysus. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, a geographical triumph, was man's first experience of concentration, condensation, and conceptualization. That's why a pharaoh is ontologically elevated, symbolizing the sun disk of emerging consciousness and Apollonian beacon. Thus, by its socio-political pyramid, Egypt creates a set and rigid stratification of social classes, resulting in an aristocracy and a sense of personality. Thus, they are the first self-designated beautiful people, as glamour and aesthetics now are imposed by the personality with its penetrating sunlight. No wonder why Oswald Spengler thought of Egypt as to be manifestation of the way, as its prime symbol. the way that curbs and trims everything that is unorderly and Dionysian. The Egyptian soul saw itself as moving down a narrower and inexorably prescribed life path to come at the end before the judges of the dead. Thus, an Egyptian is a traveler who follows an unchanging direction as opposed to the labyrinth of the unconscious. If we look at the old kingdom of Egypt, namely the mighty pyramids of the 4th dynasty, we see a new understanding of space and the interior, a sort of nature within nature that no longer pays homage to the mother archetype. This is not the interior and spatial organization of the mosque and the cathedral, but a rhythmically ordered sequence of spaces. The way leads to the chamber of the dead, through the passages, halls, arcaded courts, and pillared rooms that grow narrower and narrower as the consciousness acquires a new dimension of concreteness. Corpus callosum, a band of fiber connecting two hemispheres, shrinks in size as humans advance and become more stratified in their social organization. Thus, emerging specialization of human mental faculties is evidenced by rising political hierarchy, division of labor, specified gender roles, and intensity of Apollonian eye. Spengler points out that the sun temples of the 5th dynasty are not just buildings but represent a path enclosed by mighty masonry. For the Egyptian, the depth experience which governed his world form was so emphatically directional that he comprehended space more or less as a continuous process of actualization. Way signifies both destiny and third dimension. Although Egypt is the first that shines light onto nature, it is still a hybrid between magic/mythical consciousness structure and the mental consciousness structure of the I. Gods are still hybrids of animals and humans, denoting the gradual growth of the human ego from the depths of the organic world. That's why two animals venerated in Egypt were cat and crocodile. Both of them are a hybrid of Apollonian consciousness and Chthonian unconscious. Hefting itself between water and earth, the spiky crocodile is the West's armored ego, sinister, hostile, and ever watchful. Cat, on the other hand, represents an Apollonian I intensity with its sense of persona, dignity, and pride, and on the other hand, the harshness of nature and magic consciousness structure, as she periodically surprises her owners with a neat pile of mole guts and mashed mouse limbs on the porch, a sort of Darwinian mementos. That's why cats are of double nature, having unnerving cool stares and autocratic self-interest, but suddenly turning into the symbols of witchcraft and sorcery. Although Egypt, with the pantheon of gods, the concept of the afterworld, and the bureaucratic system of organization, demonstrably drew a straight line of consciousness on the entangled nature, we're still far from what we understand to be a subject, a cogito, a new self. So let's get to the major shift from the magic mythical consciousness to the crystallization of mental consciousness structure, which took its inspiration from the still freeze frame of the Egyptian Apollonian gaze, so that it could have turned it into an abstract ideas of Platonic philosophy. So now I'm going to present a systematic breakdown of how Dorian Greek culture, with its cerebral innovations of abstract philosophy and geometry, shown an obvious shift into acute and pointy mental consciousness structure of the I. Now, in order for us to understand the gist of how the I as a primary modus operandi of the new consciousness undergoes intensification, we need to show how the pre-mental consciousness structure of mythical/magic operated. Note that Jean Gebser takes the mental structure which emerged in Greece and Near East of Judeo-Christian religions to be spatial and abstractly temporal, with its three-dimensionality, whereas mythical and magic are spaceless and timeless. It's only in mythic that natural temporality and cyclicity are recognized. The I, an organ emphasis for mental structure, the rational hair-splitting and judging, contrasts the magic ear, the cavernous labyrinthine unconscious, and mythic mouth, which utters and sings the myths. Gebser takes mouth and myth to have common etymological roots. Now, before the mental structure emerged, whereby an ego, autonomous self, an active subject who emancipated from the interwovenness of nature, humans were continuous with nature. The Mycenaean civilization, yet to be conquered by the Dorian Greeks, is dominated by mythic consciousness. The stucco relief from Knossos, Crete, the prince with the crown of feathers, show the gradual emancipation of the soul from nature, as the upper torso is exposed against the sky, whereas the lower to the mother ground. Note that the prince is directed to the left side, which is controlled by the right hemisphere, which neuropsychiatrist Ian Mcgilchrist understand to be the house of the unconscious. The left hemisphere subject who contemplates abstract ideas is still not there. Although it is a glimpse of getting emancipated from Mother Nature, as in the first generations of civilizations we find the discovery of the soul and the inner world along with the temporality of time, our sequential understanding of it is still not crystallized. This shift takes place in the 6th and 5th century BC, which is mirrored by the image of Athena springing forth from the head of Zeus, symbolizing the coming dominance of reason and ratio, where the male sky god, with the advancement of mentally patriarchal structure, overtakes the power of childbearing. Note how Athena wears the Gorgos head on her breast and shield, a gift of Perseus. Now, the following analysis will account for those cultural aspects with an arborescent model, whereby all those twigs share one common root. Hence, we should be able to see the clear difference between the roots, through which its effects will be self-explanatory. The evolution of mind's eye, which presupposes the existence of the subject, a conscious, intentional being who has a unifying sense of self, can be witnessed in the transitional period of Greek culture, namely from the great Mycenaean civilization to Dorian Greece. An American psychologist, Julian Jaynes, attempts to see Illiad as a litmus paper to see how subjectless characters evolved into a persona with a unifying sense as opposed to the modular, i.e. bicameral. Thus the name of his magnus opus, The Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. Now, although his neuroscience definitely cannot be described as cutting edge, which I will address in other videos, the value of his book comes from his analysis of so-called mental language and how it underwent major changes. For our interest, I want to draw your attention to how the words for mental processes and conscious states are lacking in the language of the Iliad, and how those words acquire the aforementioned meaning throughout the cultural evolution. The word psyche, which later means soul or conscious mind, is in most instances life substances such as blood or breath. A dying warrior bleeds out his psyche onto the ground or breathes it out in his last gasp. The thumos, which later comes to mean something like an emotional soul, is simply motion or agitation. When a man stops moving, the thumos lifts his limbs. The thumos can tell a man to eat, drink, or fight. Diomedes says in one place that Achilles will fight when the thumos in his chest tells him to, and God rouses him. But it is not really an organ and not always localized. A raging ocean has thumos. Remember that Gebser understood mythic and magic as being characterized by bodily senses, a world feeling as opposed to world view, where there is no distinction between a self as a soul, self as a rational mind, and a body as a vessel of the two. Rather, it is a unity with nature in magic structure and partial emancipation in the mythic. When Ionic philosophy will be born, we will witness an aggressive shift from ear to the eye, with which Presocratic philosophers with a new mind's eye will come up with mental models of the universe, governed by new rules of consciousness such as dialectical relations, causality, and temporality, a sort of arrow of the time. Thus, the Heraclitean notion that you can't get in the river twice. With the emergence of mental consciousness structure, time is understood as something that is linear and conceptual, rather than circular and ever-present. However, the Apollonian freeze frame of Egypt will resurface in Platonic philosophy, which will harden the Heraclitean stream into a stone of ideas. Thus, the shift from Medusa, who turns people into stone, to a philosophy that freezes being into discrete ideas that can be fathomed by the power of the mind's eye. Now let's get back to the theme of mental language. Phren is always localized anatomically as the midriff, or sensations in the midriff, and is usually used in the plural. It is the phrenes of Hector that recognized that his brother is not near him. This means what we mean by catching one's breath in surprise. It is only centuries later that it comes to mean mind or heart in its figurative sense. And now we get to the most important word for our topic, which is nous, which comes to mean a conscious mind, and acquires highest metaphysical value in Neoplatonism, as nous is the ultimate mind from which the universe is conceived. Well, not surprisingly, it comes from the word noein, to see. Its proper translation in the Iliad would be something like perception or recognition or field of vision. Zeus holds Odysseus in his nous. He keeps watch over him. However, the nous has yet to acquire its new meaning, and is never used to describe a doubt or being in a conflict, as conflict is often said to go on in the thumos or in phrenes. Now, for Jaynes, the major difference relevant to this theme between the bicameral society and integrated one is a shift from an auditory mind to a visual mind, which ironically coincides with Gebser's understanding of consciousness structures, although I doubt that one read another. Schopenhauer is in the bandwagon too. Sight has the highest rank because its sphere is the widest and its susceptibility the finest. Hearing has second place. Now, the reason Jaynes holds this position has to do with his understanding of the divided brain, which characterized ancient people, whereby the left hemisphere harbored God, who made commands to the right hemisphere. He believed that all the commands in ancient literature where God spoke to warriors or chosen people were actually heard, and is not a trope or poetic metaphor. He makes somewhat disconcerting claim that they were in a schizophrenic state, resorting to the fact that hallucinations, the voice of gods, come into play in the process of decision-making, when characters are in a divided state, where they have to choose the route of action. This causes a hyper-stressful situation, which causes them to hallucinate. As stress, even nowadays, dramatically increase the chance of having hallucinations. After the integration of the two hemispheres took place, according to Julian, the consciousness and unifying sense, as we know it, began to emerge. Now, to intensify this line of reasoning, note how we people of the 21st century intuitively regard hearing voices as more alarming than seeing things. Like, imagine someone telling you that they have seen something, which is not quite uncommon. However, I'm sure that your friend telling you about how he would hear voices would unnerve you even further. This is a type of a priori bias and prejudice that we can take for granted. Let's see what Gebser has to say about this. Everything that belongs to us, Gehören, with its connotations of the auditory, Hören, to hear, is an expression of our power or might. It belongs to the magic structure and is attuned to its unity. Everything we see is an expression of our understanding, and the seeing and conceptualizing are commensurate with the mental structure. It's interesting to note how authors from different backgrounds arrive at more or less the same conclusion about the difference between the new consciousness, where a subject with a unifying sense of self and power of abstractions comes to the stage, and the pre-classical person, who is not a subject yet, as we understand it today. Jaynes notes that vision is our distant receptor par excellence. Now I want to look at how Mcgilchrist's ideas fortify this line of reasoning. I want to concentrate on the word distance, as it is a great keyword for understanding the consciousness of the mind's eye. The new nous, what we know as consciousness, is a type of Cartesian theater, a space within which the drama of reality is played out, a three-dimensional spatial fabric that allows us to simulate possible realities, contemplate about future, travel in the past as we are going over old archives, and have a sense that there is an inner me who is witnessing and watching these processes that are taking place in the mystical place called consciousness. This is what's known as user interface illusion, whereby your mind constructs an accessible desktop so that you can have an illusion of navigating into a spatial container that simulates reality as such. The reason for such metaphors that we use in everyday life to describe our mental states has to do with ignorance of how it actually works, because if it was crystal clear, then metaphors would be redundant. Mostly metaphors are used when we want to describe something that is very complex and involves different strata of reality. Thus, although you could describe that particular thing with a conventional word, you still refuse to do so, as intuitively you understand how a single word will constrain and limit the thing that you want to communicate. Now let's explain how a new consciousness with the ability to distance itself from the existence accounts for cultural achievements of mental structure. These processes require an ability to stand back from and detach ourselves from the crowds, from nature, and from ourselves that we may objectify. This is, in my view, also the basis for the forging of the bridge with others and with nature, which classically and according to much of neurophysiological literature is mediated by the right hemisphere. So in order for you to connect, you need to detach in the first place, following the Hegelian theme that union cannot exist without separation and distinction. However, the latter is of no use if it does not lead to the greater synthesis. Now let's get to the concept of distance and how it helps us to further assemble the puzzle. Ian Mcgilchrist comes up with the concept of a necessary distance, which he believes to be a result of advancement in the bihemispheric prefrontal cortex, and to our point, he situated this occurrence in Greek culture. First, we have to take a quick detour to the east, which shows a demonstrable contrast between the ontological status of the eye of the west and the east. What's notable is the closed eye of the Buddha and the third eye of Hinduism. Because East views the material world as a veil of illusion, samsara, the element of an epistemologically aggressive subject which penetrates nature with a triangle of mental consciousness structure is non-existent and superfluous. The analogy that I came up with to describe the fundamental ontological difference between the Eastern and Western subjects is of the hunter and the fisher. You see, East listens to nature, so that it can pour into the space of the mind, using it as a vessel, so that the subject can be purified from the contamination of the material world. This shows how Eastern meditation stands in direct opposition to the active subject of the West. A hunter is someone who blocks out every domain of consciousness that interferes with its directive goals, and wrath with which the Illiad opens. The word menin, a wrath of Achilles, has the following meaning. The Greek word menis, meaning wrath and courage, comes from the same stem as word menas, which means resolve, anger, courage, and power. It is related also to the Latin word mens, which has an unusually complex set of meanings: intent, anger, thinking, thought, understanding, deliberation, disposition, mentality, imagination. Against the backdrop of the Western subject with its hunting epistemology and hegemony of nature, symbolized by splitting the sea by Moses, walking on water by Jesus, and stripping women from their reproductive capabilities, we have a fishing modality of the Eastern subject, which lets the Tao reveal itself, thus a concept of the passive subject. Note how when people explain the essence of meditation, we're told that the highest achievement is when you realize that thought processes going on in your head do not belong to you, and you have no authorship over them. This directly translates into how the East attempts to comprehend reality with closed eyes, as it is inward related rather than outward related. Thus the concept of mysticism, speechless contemplation with closed eyes, that is, eyes turned inward. According to Gebser, the identical deed that prompts Christ to accept suffering via his conscious ego leads in Buddhism to the negation of suffering and to the dissolution of the ego, which transformed returns to the original state of immaterial nirvana. In Buddhism, the suspension of sorrow and the ego is held in esteem, and this suspension of sorrow and suffering is realized by turning away from the world. For Christianity, the goal is to accept the ego, and the acceptance of sorrow and suffering is to be achieved by loving the world. Thus, the perilous and difficult path along which the West must proceed is here prefigured, a course which it is following through untold hardship and misery. Two passages from the New Testament that I selected should settle the question. Here's Jesus speaking to Agrippa. To open their eyes and turn them from darkness to light, and from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. Here's how Jesus uses the metaphor of the eye in the Sermon on the Mount. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. What's fascinating about the Greek myths and tragedies is the prevalence of blindness as punishment, and how the role of seeing is intensified. Here are some examples. Orpheus, who desired to rescue his wife Eurydice from the underworld, was commanded by Hades to never look back, while her wife would follow him through the land of the living. Getting to the threshold when they were leaving the underworld, Orpheus saw the sun and turned back to look at his beloved Eurydice. At that moment, tragedy struck as she disappeared back to the underworld. Remember how Erymanthus was blinded after he saw Aphrodite bathing. Zeus defeats the Titans by blinding them with a flash of light. Graii, 3 old sisters with one eye, have been robbed by Perseus, thus leaving them blind. Ephialtes was a giantess, slain by Apollo and Heracles in the war against the gods. Each pierced one of the giantess' eyes with their arrows. The tragedy of the king of Oedipus is a failure of the eye par excellence. His literal blindness is caused by the metaphorical lack of insight and knowledge. Note how Oedipus and prophet Tiresias accuse each other of blindness, denoting the lack of insight. However, in this case, Tiresias has the mind's eye, a prophetic vision, a higher sense of the eye. Thus his prophecy turns out to be correct. Note that Tiresias was blinded by Athena as he saw her bathing. His prophetic powers were given by gods as a form of compensation. The fact that Oedipus chose blinding as a form of self-punishment, but not other things, is also not arbitrary. There are numerous examples of characters being blinded as a punishment or in exchange for greater power. However, the bottom line is clear. sight acquires a huge metaphorical significance in the mental consciousness structure of the upcoming Greek culture. It is not accident that Russell's first philosopher, the Thales, was an astronomer, a person whose epistemologically aggressive gaze was so intense that according to the popular fable, while contemplating and enjoying stars, he fell in the well. His servant caustically remarked, "How can you comprehend the world if you can't watch your feet?" Now that is a totally new concept of an absent-minded thinker, where the act of seeing acquires a new dimension of mind space. What's fascinating about Presocratics is their willingness to come up with an extended model of existence, which is housed by the newly emerged mind space of the eye. This is the necessary distance brought by the strengthened connection between the frontal cortex and parietal association cortices that houses the ability of spatial reasoning and abstract categories. Presocratics were interested in the arche, and they wanted to see through the beginning of existence with their telescopic mind's eye, which would eventually become materialized in the Western culture. Thus the Presocratic notion of truth, which is hidden from us and we need to engage in unconcealment. This shows the absolute importance of visual metaphor in seeking knowledge. Thus Heraclitus' anti-Eastern epistemology, whereby he maintains that if we want to discover the nature of reality, we need to pay attention to the phenomenal world, as opposed to turning inwards. Elsewhere he writes that eyes are surer witnesses than ears. In other words, Western sense accepts the phenomenal external world and seeks truth in it, as opposed to the East, which wholeheartedly rejects the material world. Thus, the theory of truth, which is known as correspondence theory, is purely Western, as in order for a statement to be true, one's assertions should correspond to facts of reality. For the last part of the video, we need to address Platonism and the concept of contemplation, i.e. Theorein, and the theory of forms, along with the analogy of the cave. Note how Plato takes the sun to be an analogy of the highest truth, as the sun is something that makes everything visible. This fact suggests the fundamental equation of seeing being equal with knowledge, which is evident throughout the Indo-European languages. Thus, coming out from the cave, the darkness of magic consciousness structure is equated with attaining higher truth. The theory of forms is not just an add-on to an existing philosophical corpus, but rather a paradigm shift, a new way of conceiving the world. The word paradigm has to do with seeing, as it comes from the two Greek words, paradeiknunai, meaning to show side by side. For Plato, the modus operandi of knowing is contemplation, which in the Greek language is theorein, from which the word theory comes. Note that theorein means to look at. However, we have a twist of language whereby through an infinitive form of the verb theoreo, I see, we get an abstract concept of contemplation, i.e. theorein. Here it takes on the meaning we normally associate with seeing, the eye apprehending an object. Interestingly, it was not originally a verb, but it's a back formation from the word for a spectator, theoros. What I take from this is that it is derived from what was thought of as a special situation, one of greater than usual detachment from a spectacle. Words for thinking in the sense of abstract cognition and words for seeing come to be closely related. The prominence after the Homeric era of theorein and noien when compared with the earlier terms for seeing marks a degree of abstraction from what is under consideration. A related distinction touched on above arises between aspects of the mind between thumos and nous, where broadly thumos is instinct, what keeps the body in motion, coupled with emotion, whereas nous is reflection, ideas and images. Already it would appear that the Greeks were making felt distinctions between thought and experience, as mediated by the left hemisphere and as mediated by the right. As Parmenides said that thinking is a being, Plato also understands theorein as a mode of thinking by which you comprehend the essences and the existence of things, thus transporting us into a new layer of abstract thought. Therefore, the Apollonian mind's eye, with its ability to comprehend the essence, acquires an ability to create genera, i.e. abstract categories, namely Platonic ideas or Aristotelian forms from the particular objects. As Mcgilchrist points out, this process has to do with the advance of the left hemisphere, which houses abstract decontextualized thought. To further the Neuro-Antrhopology, the reorganization of the brain should be evident, whereby the connections between the frontal lobe, namely the inferior frontal gyrus and the left anterior temporal lobe, has to do with housing abstractions over concrete words. Also, it's interesting how people with left temporal lobe epilepsy tend to be obsessed with abstract thoughts and become extremely pedantic, argumentative, egocentric, and garrulous. The nous coming from the visual sensation takes the highest value for Plato. In dialogues it is described as the highest sense. In Philebus, Socrates says that all philosophers agree, whereby they really exalt themselves, that mind, nous, is king of heaven and earth. Perhaps they are right. He also states that mind, nous, always rules the universe. In his Cratylus, Plato gives the etymology of Athena's name, the goddess of wisdom, from Atheonoa, meaning God's mind. Remember Athena springing from the head of Zeus and carrying the Gorgon's head? Thus we have a shift from Heraclitean flux of nature to an Apollonian freeze frame of Plato's ideas. However, now, unlike Egypt, we have a fully crystallized mental consciousness structure whose prime symbol for Gebser is the triangle. Remember the engraving on the door of Plato's academy? Let no one ignorant of geometry enter. It is noteworthy to mention that the occult knowledge that Socrates derives from the divine sources, i.e. knowledge of the magical consciousness structure, is primarily heard, emphasizing the labyrinthine cavernous ear, where the knowledge of the science is seen and thus is contemplated. Socrates doesn't see the daemon, but rather daemon speaks to him. It is also not accidental that in Plato's tripartite theory of the soul, the rational part, i.e. logistikon, which meant vision, is of the highest value, being the horseman of the whole body. Thus, adopting Jaynesian understanding of the breakdown of the bicameral mind, we enter into a condition when a human body is now understood as a unity of parts governed by reason, as opposed to the sense that is presented in the language of the Illiad, where notion of the whole body is lacking. The reason, named logistikon, comes from the word logos, which is the most famous word in Greek philosophy, being the highest truth in Heraclitean philosophy, and then representing abstract thought and formal logic. What's fascinating is that logos, which means the word, is also connected to the eye and seeing. The word logos is connected with the word thing, as they both derive from Indo-European leg, meaning to gather, collect. Then it is connected with calculating, reading and writing, as in Greek legein, to reckon, say. Latin legere, from which lectio, a reading, in compounds like Greek analecta, collection of sayings, analogia, proportionate, apologos, story, dialogos, conversion, Latin intelligere, choose among, colligere, collect, and in English a host of words primarily pertaining to thought and literary expression, as in logic, intelligence, lecture, analogy, epilogue, prologue, lexicon, dialogue, syllogism, select, trilogy, monologue, and many others. On the whole, logos indicates a peculiar class of things, assemblages, assembled with the eyes by means of the intermediary alphabet, the visible substitutes for the things themselves, that are the words we have for them and the words we have of them. To summarize the video, although incomplete, we have explored the conception of the eye as a metaphor for knowledge from ancient Egypt to the classical Greece. Also comparing the Indo-European equation of knowledge being equal to seeing with other language families and cultures of the East. The key takeaway is that with the emergence of mental consciousness structure, the eye as a metaphor for knowledge and truth is hypertrophied and intensified. However, the absolute apotheosis of the eye has yet to happen, and if this video generates enough interest, I will make the following video about the Western culture, going deep into language differences and Western cultural elements, where the eye becomes the dominant organ in every sphere of existence. Thus, in the second part of the video, I will review how perspective was born in Renaissance, venerating the power of the eye. We will go through Shakespeare and Goethe's Faust, showing how contemplation and the eye took a position of the highest power. I will look at Foucault's concept of the panopticon, and reveal how the eye experienced an evolution to its pathologically inflamed state. Thank you for watching. I appreciate your sincere interest. Special thanks to my cousin who donated his own personal computer so that I can edit my videos. Special thanks to my Patreons for supporting the channel, as it makes these videos possible.